In the glittering VIP lounge of the Regal Aces Casino, a quiet, aging martial artist was about to be publicly shamed. A night of high-stakes baccarat turned vicious when a brash influencer and his entourage hijacked the game and ordered Steven Seagal thrown out. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical casino patron. For over 5 decades, he was a decorated aikido master and Hollywood action legend, known for teaching conflict de-escalation to law enforcement across 3 continents. When Blaze Monroe broadcast his mockery live to millions and had Seagal forcibly removed, they had no idea they were goading a tactician who studied enemies the way monks study silence. Seagal re-entered through the service door with precision and purpose, delivering a lesson so surgical it unraveled reputations in real time. What began as a viral prank would become a clinic in character. The Regal Aces wouldn't just remember the cards played that night, but the legend who reshuffled the house without lifting his voice. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Atlantic City boardwalk hummed with the electric promise of midnight fortune as Steven Seagal stepped from his rental car into the humid Jersey air. Neon signs painted the darkness in shades of amber and emerald, their glow reflecting off the wet pavement like scattered diamonds. The Regal Aces Casino rose before him like a monument to excess, its gold-trimmed facade promising dreams and delivering nightmares with equal measure. At 63, Seagal moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned that true power whispered rather than shouted. His black leather jacket hung loose over dark jeans, and his silver hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No entourage, no fanfare. Just a man seeking the quiet rhythm of cards and chips after 3 grueling months on the road raising money for forgotten veterans. The casino's revolving doors spun lazily as he entered, the sudden blast of air conditioning carrying the scent of cigarette smoke, expensive cologne, and that particular brand of desperation that clung to gambling halls like morning fog. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors polished to mirror brightness, while the distant symphony of slot machines created a mechanical lullaby that never quite fell silent. Mr. Seagal, a young woman in a burgundy blazer, approached with the practiced smile of casino hospitality. I'm Jessica from VIP Services. We'd be honored to. Thank you. Seagal interrupted gently, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. But I prefer to find my own way. She nodded, understanding immediately. Some legends walked alone. At the baccarat tables, race stacks. D'Angelo shuffled cards with the fluid precision of a man who had been dealing since the days when Atlantic City was more boardwalk than billion-dollar resort. His weathered hands moved like poetry, each motion economical and exact. 40 years behind these felt surfaces had taught him to read souls the way others read newspapers. When Seagal approached table 7, Ray's eyes flickered with recognition, not the starstruck gawking of a fan, but the respectful acknowledgement of one craftsman recognizing another. Evening, Ray said simply, his voice carrying the gravelly wisdom of old Atlantic City. Minimum's 500. But something tells me you're not here for minimums. Seagal settled into the leather chair with the careful precision of a man who understood that every movement was a choice. Sometimes the quiet games reveal the most. Ray smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered features. Been saying that for decades. Nice to meet someone who gets it. The first shoe began with the ritual elegance that had drawn high rollers to baccarat tables since the game's inception. Seagal played with the patience of a mountain, folding more hands than he entered, his dark eyes reading not just the cards but the rhythm of the room itself. When he did play, his bets were surgical, calculated not for the thrill, but for the art of the game. You're not like the usual crowd, Ray observed during a quiet moment between hands. Most folks come here looking for excitement. You look like you're looking for peace. Same thing, sometimes, Seagal replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Depends on how you define the game. 20 feet away, Carmen Del Toro watched the monitors from her security station with the trained eye of someone who had spent 20 years reading trouble before it announced itself. Former Navy Master-at-Arms turned casino security chief, she possessed the rare combination of tactical awareness and moral compass that made her invaluable in a world where both were in short supply. Something about the man at table 7 caught her attention, not concern, but curiosity. While other high rollers postured and performed, this one simply existed, moving through the casino's manufactured chaos like a stone in a river, unmoved by the current. "Who's the cowboy at 7? Asked Martinez, her night shift supervisor. Carmen studied the monitor. "Steven Seagal. Actor, martial artist. Been here about an hour." "Any trouble?" "Opposite. He's like a black hole for drama. Everything settles down around him." 3 levels above, in the penthouse suite that served as both office and playground, Blaze Monroe finished editing his latest prank video with the manic energy of someone perpetually high on their own importance. At 28, he possessed the kind of aggressive charisma that came from never truly being told no, combined with the hollow neediness of someone whose worth was measured in likes and shares. The video showed him testing a tourist's courage by having Ty corner the man in a bathroom while Blaze filmed through a crack in the door. The tourist's genuine fear was comedy gold for Blaze's 3 million followers, who consumed cruelty like candy. "Dropped another banger," Blaze announced to his entourage, a collection of hangers-on whose primary job was laughing at his jokes and holding his cameras. 2 million views in the first hour. "The sheep are hungry tonight." Ty Slugger Monroe stood near the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the Atlantic City skyline. Former semi-pro boxer turned family bodyguard, he carried the quiet weight of someone who had learned the difference between strength and bullying the hard way. His losses in the ring had taught him that real power wasn't about throwing punches. It was about knowing when not to. "That guy looked pretty scared," Ty said quietly. "That's the point, cousin," Blaze replied, already scanning for his next target. "Fear is content. Content is cash. Cash is everything." Nina Chin reviewed footage from her own camera setup in the casino's main floor, her YouTube channel built on documenting the strange theater of Las Vegas nightlife. But lately, something had been gnawing at her, a growing sense that turning real people's pain into entertainment was corroding something essential inside her. Through her viewfinder, she watched the quiet man at the baccarat table and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Genuine curiosity about someone's story rather than their potential for viral content. "Different kind of player," she murmured to herself, adjusting her lens. As the night deepened, the casino's rhythms began to shift. The dinner crowd gave way to the serious players, the tourists yielded to the regulars, and the bright chatter of evening mellowed into the hushed intensity of midnight money. Seagal remained at table 7, his stack of chips growing with the steady inevitability of compound interest. But those who knew how to look, Ray, Carmen, even Nina, could see that winning wasn't the point. This was meditation disguised as gambling, a form of moving prayer that happened to involve cards. None of them knew that 3 floors above, Blaze Monroe was scrolling through the casino's guest list, his predatory instincts sharpening as he spotted a name that made his eyes light up with the hungry gleam of a shark sensing blood. "Boys," he announced to his crew, "I think we just found our next masterpiece." The quiet storm was about to begin. The baccarat table had become an island of tranquility in the casino's manufactured chaos. Seagal sat with the patient stillness of a man who had learned that true power never advertised itself, his movements economical and precise as he studied, each hand with the focus of a chess master contemplating his next move. "Been watching you play for 2 hours. Ray observed as he dealt fresh cards, his voice carrying the warm approval of someone who had seen countless players chase fool's gold. "Haven't seen discipline like this since the old days, when players understood the game was about character, not just cards." Seagal accepted his cards with a slight nod. "My sensei used to say that how a man sits at a table reveals everything about how he stands in the world." "Smart man. Aikido?" "Among other things." Seagal's eyes remained on his cards, but Ray caught the ghost of a smile. "The principles are the same everywhere. Balance, patience, knowing when to act and when to wait." The conversation drew the attention of the other players at the table. Dr. Elizabeth Carey, a cardiac surgeon whose steady hands had saved thousands of lives, leaned forward with interest. "I've always found that the most dangerous people are the quietest ones. They're usually the ones who've seen enough to know that real strength doesn't need to prove itself." "Exactly," Seagal replied, placing his bet with the ceremonial precision of a monk lighting incense. Violence is easy. Anyone can break things. Building something, protecting something, that takes real skill. 20 feet away, Nina chin adjusted her camera settings and found herself genuinely interested in the conversation rather than just hunting for dramatic footage. Through her viewfinder, she watched Seagal's hands, scarred, weathered, but moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades turning combat into art. This guy's different, she murmured to herself, lowering her camera. For the first time in months, she was more interested in listening than filming. The atmosphere shifted when the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, disgorging Blaze Monroe and his entourage like a fever dream of modern celebrity culture. Blaze strutted through the casino with the aggressive confidence of someone who had confused attention with respect, his phone already recording as he performed for his audience. "What's good, degenerates?" he called out to his camera, his voice carrying across the previously hushed gambling floor. "Your boy Blaze is about to teach Atlantic City how the game is really played." Behind him, Ty followed with the reluctant loyalty of family obligation, his massive frame serving as both bodyguard and unwilling prop in Blaze's never-ending performance. The rest of the crew, camera operators, social media managers, and professional laughers, fanned out like a film crew preparing to shoot a scene. Nina instinctively raised her camera, her journalistic instincts warring with a growing sense of unease. She had covered enough influencer events to recognize the particular brand of manufactured chaos that Blaze specialized in, the kind that turned real people into unwilling extras in someone else's ego project. "Target-rich environment tonight," Blaze announced to his phone, panning across the casino floor. "Lot of old money, old players, old ideas about respect. Time to show them how the new generation handles business." Carmen Del Toro watched the monitors from her security station with the focused intensity of someone who had learned to read trouble in the subtle shift of body language. She had dealt with Blaze before. His father's ownership of the casino made him untouchable, but that didn't make him any less dangerous to the delicate ecosystem of high-stakes gaming. "Monroe's on the floor," she reported to her supervisor. "Full entourage, cameras rolling." "Any specific threats?" Carmen studied the screens, noting how conversations died and players tensed wherever Blaze passed. "He's hunting. Question is what for?" The answer came when Blaze's predatory skin settled on table 7. Through the camera lens, he watched Seagal's quiet concentration, the respectful attention of the other players, the reverential way Ray dealt cards to someone he clearly considered worthy of respect. Well, well," Blaze murmured to his phone, zooming in on Seagal's profile. "Look what we have here, chat. Steven fucking Seagal. The man, the myth, the meme. Looking a little long in the tooth, don't you think?" The comment section exploded with fire emojis and laughing faces, the digital mob sensing blood in the water. Blaze fed off their energy like a vampire feeding on sunlight, his confidence growing with each notification. "Should we go say hello?" one of his crew asked, already knowing the answer. "Oh, we're definitely going to say hello," Blaze replied, his grin taking on a predatory quality. "Time to see if all those movies were just special effects." Ty shifted uncomfortably. "Blaze, maybe we should." "Should what?" "This is content gold, cousin. 3 million followers want to see what happens when fake tough meets real tough. Who am I to disappoint them?" At table 7, the approaching storm was still invisible to most players, but Seagal's peripheral awareness, honed by decades of training, caught the change in the room's energy. His hands remained steady on his cards, but something in his posture shifted, like a cat becoming aware of movement in tall grass. Ray noticed it too. "Everything all right?" "Just listening," Seagal replied quietly. "The room's about to get interesting." Dr. Carey glanced around nervously. "Should we be concerned?" "Concern is just fear with a college degree," Seagal said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had faced real danger and learned to distinguish between genuine threats and theatrical posturing. "Whatever's coming, it's not coming for you." Nina lowered her camera as she watched Blaze's crew position themselves around table 7 like a pack of wolves circling prey. The journalism part of her brain recognized a story in the making, but something deeper, some remnant of moral instinct that hadn't been completely eroded by the content economy, made her stomach turn. "This is going to be ugly," she whispered to herself. Carmen's fingers hovered over her radio as she watched the monitors. Protocol dictated that she maintain order, but her definition of order was about to be tested by the collision of two very different philosophies of power. Units 7 and 12, eyes on table 7, she broadcast quietly. We might have a situation developing. The casino's carefully maintained atmosphere of sophisticated vice began to crack as other players noticed the unusual concentration of cameras and attention. Conversations died. Cards were forgotten. The ancient human instinct to watch predators hunt drew everyone's attention to the coming confrontation. Blaze approached table 7 with the theatrical confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences, his phone held high like a weapon. Behind him, Ty followed with the heavy reluctance of someone who knew the difference between courage and stupidity but was bound by loyalty to follow anyway. Showtime, Blaze announced to his camera, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent casino floor. At the table, Seagal continued studying his cards with the unruffled composure of a man who had learned that the loudest storms often did the least damage. But those who knew how to look, Ray, Carmen, Nina, could see the subtle change in his breathing, the almost imperceptible shift in his center of gravity. The quiet storm was about to meet the loud one, and Atlantic City was about to learn the difference between performance and presence. The casino floor held its breath as Blaze Monroe approached table 7 like a predator circling wounded prey. His phone camera captured every step, broadcasting live to hundreds of thousands of viewers who had tuned in for their nightly dose of vicarious cruelty. The chat rolled by in a blur of fire emojis and encouraging violence, a digital coliseum. Hungry for blood. Ladies and gentlemen, Blaze announced to his camera, his voice carrying the theatrical confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. We're about to conduct a little experiment in reality versus Hollywood. Seagal remained focused on his cards, his breathing steady and deep. Ray's weathered hands paused mid-shuffle, and Dr. Carey instinctively leaned back in her chair, recognizing the particular tension that preceded violence. Steven Seagal, Blaze called out, his tone dripping with manufactured familiarity. The man, the myth, the martial arts master. Mind if I ask you a question? The baccarat table had become the center of a growing circle of onlookers, casino patrons drawn by the magnetic pull of potential conflict. Nina Chen raised her camera reluctantly, torn between her professional instincts and a growing sense of moral nausea. Seagal placed his cards face down with deliberate precision and turned to face Blaze. His dark eyes held the calm intensity of deep water, revealing nothing and reflecting everything. Young man, Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of patience tested but not broken. I'm here to enjoy a quiet game with civilized people. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the louder tables. The suggestion landed like a slap. Blaze's followers erupted in digital laughter, but their mockery was directed at what they perceived as weakness rather than the diplomatic wisdom of someone choosing restraint over escalation. Oh, this is rich, Blaze continued, turning his camera to capture both himself and Seagal in the frame. The tough guy doesn't want to play. What happened to all that aikido mastery? All those years of teaching cops how to kick ass? Aikido teaches harmony, Seagal replied, his voice remaining steady despite the rising tension. It's about redirecting force, not creating it. Perhaps you should try it sometime. Harmony, Blaze repeated, his tone mocking. Is that what we're calling it when has-been actors pretend they're still relevant? The insult hung in the air like smoke. Around the table, the other players shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the particular brand of cruelty that came from someone who had never learned the difference between strength and bullying. Ty stood behind Blaze, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. Unlike his cousin, Ty had been in real fights, had felt the terrible intimacy of violence, and learned to respect those who chose restraint over aggression. Something in Seagal's composure reminded him of the old trainers who had taught him that the most dangerous fighters were the ones who didn't need to prove anything. Blaze, Ty said quietly, maybe we should what? Blaze snapped, his performance energy spiking with manic intensity. This is content gold, cousin. 3 million people want to see what happens when fake tough meets real questions. Carmen del Toro watched the monitors with growing tension, her hand resting on her radio. Years of military service had taught her to recognize the difference between posturing and genuine threat. But she also knew that sometimes the most dangerous situations started with the most theatrical provocations. All units, maintain position, she broadcast. We have a potential situation at table 7. Nina lowered her camera, unable to continue filming what felt increasingly like a public execution. Through her viewfinder, she had watched Seagal's face throughout the confrontation, noting the subtle signs of someone choosing restraint over retaliation, the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible shift in his breathing, the way his hands remained perfectly still despite the obvious provocation. "This isn't entertainment," she murmured to herself. "This is just cruelty with better lighting." "Tell you what," Blaze continued, his voice rising with theatrical excitement. "Why don't you show us some of that legendary aikido? Nothing too crazy, just enough to prove you're not all Hollywood smoke and mirrors." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in an ancient arena. Around the table, the other players exchanged nervous glances, understanding that they were witnessing something that would either end in violence or humiliation, with no middle ground in sight. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Seagal's response came with the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades learning to choose his battles wisely. "Son, I've spent my life learning when to fight and when to walk away. Tonight, I choose to walk away." "Walk away," Blaze repeated, his tone triumphant. "You hear that, chat? The great Steven Seagal chooses to walk away. What do you think that makes him?" The chat exploded with cruel laughter and mocking emojis. Blaze fed off their energy like a vampire feeding on sunlight, his confidence growing with each notification. But those who knew how to look, Ray, Carmen, Nina, even Ty, could see that Seagal's choice to disengage wasn't fear, but wisdom. There was something in his stillness that suggested coiled power, like a mountain that appeared peaceful until you realized it was a volcano. "Actually," Blaze said, his voice taking on a more calculated tone, "I don't think we can let you walk away. See, this is a family establishment, and we don't like troublemakers disrupting the peace." The accusation was breathtaking in its audacity, blaming Seagal for the very disruption that Blaze had orchestrated. But it was also tactically brilliant, providing a pretext for what came next. "Security," Blaze called out, his voice carrying across the casino floor. "I think we have a situation here. This gentleman seems to be causing a disturbance." The words landed like a hammer blow. Around the table, the other players stared in shocked silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that transcended simple bullying and entered the realm of systematic humiliation. Carmen del Toro felt her stomach drop as she realized what was happening. Protocol dictated that she respond to reports of disturbances, but her conscience rebelled against being used as a weapon in someone else's power play. "All units, respond to Table 7, she broadcast, her voice heavy with reluctant duty. "We have a reported disturbance." Nina raised her camera again, but this time with a different purpose. If she was going to witness an injustice, she was going to document it accurately, not as entertainment, but as evidence. "This is wrong," she whispered to herself, but kept filming. The security team approached with the professional efficiency of people who had broken up countless casino disputes. But something in the atmosphere made them hesitate. This wasn't the usual drunk tourist or card cheat. This was something else entirely. Seagal rose from his chair with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades learning to move like water. He nodded respectfully to Ray, who watched with the heartbroken expression of someone witnessing the destruction of something beautiful. "Thank you for the game," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying no trace of anger or humiliation. "Perhaps another time." The simple dignity of his response made Blaze's victory feel hollow, even to his own followers. The chat began to shift, with more viewers questioning the fairness of the confrontation and others calling out the obvious setup. But Blaze was too high on his own performance to notice the changing tide. "That's right," he announced to his camera. "Keep walking. That's what legends do. They walk away when things get real." The words would haunt him soon enough. But for now, he basked in what he believed was triumph, unaware that he had just made an enemy of someone who understood that the most dangerous battles were fought with patience, not passion. The security team moved with practiced efficiency, their black uniforms cutting through the casino's golden atmosphere like shadows through candlelight. Carmen del Toro led the formation, her face a mask of professional neutrality that barely concealed the storm brewing beneath. "Sir," she addressed Seagal, her voice carrying the weight of reluctant authority, "I need to ask you to come with us." Seagal stood with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades learning to move like water, his dark eyes meeting Carmen's with an understanding that transcended words. He could see the conflict in her expression, the war between duty and conscience that was tearing her apart from the inside. "Of course," he replied quietly, his voice carrying no trace of anger or resistance. "I understand you're just doing your job." The simple dignity of his response hit Carmen like a physical blow. She had expected anger, indignation, perhaps even violence, the usual responses of someone being publicly humiliated. Instead, she faced the calm acceptance of someone who understood that fighting the wrong battle often meant losing the war. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. Blaze's camera captured every moment, his live stream now drawing over 500,000 viewers who had tuned in to witness what he was billing as the ultimate reality check. The chat scrolled by in a blur of fire emojis and cruel laughter, but a growing number of comments questioned the fairness of the confrontation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blaze announced to his audience, his voice drunk on perceived victory. "This is what happens when Hollywood tough meets Atlantic City real. Sometimes the legend just isn't what it used to be." Nina Chen filmed with shaking hands, her professional instincts warring with her growing moral revulsion. Through her viewfinder, she watched Seagal's face throughout the humiliation, noting the subtle signs of someone choosing grace over fury, the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible deepening of his breathing, the way his hands remained perfectly still despite the obvious injustice. "This is wrong," she whispered to herself, but kept the camera rolling. If she was going to witness an injustice, she was going to document it accurately. Ray Stacks, D'Angelo watched from behind the baccarat table with the heartbroken expression of someone witnessing the destruction of something beautiful. 40 years of dealing cards had taught him to recognize class when he saw it. And what he was witnessing now was the systematic humiliation of someone who possessed more dignity in defeat than his tormentor had in victory. "Shame," he murmured to himself, his weathered hands unconsciously straightening the cards that would never again be dealt to someone who truly understood the game. Dr. Carey and the other players sat in stunned silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that transcended simple bullying and entered the realm of moral obscenity. The casino's carefully maintained atmosphere of sophisticated vice had been shattered by the crude spectacle of public humiliation. Ty Slugger, Monroe stood behind his cousin with the heavy reluctance of someone who knew the difference between strength and cruelty but was bound by loyalty to follow anyway. His own experiences in the ring had taught him that the most dangerous opponents were often the quietest ones, the fighters who didn't need to prove anything because they had already proven everything. Something in Seagal's composure reminded him of those old trainers who had taught him that real power came from knowing when not to use it. As he watched the older man accept his humiliation with quiet dignity, Ty felt something twist inside his chest, a recognition of honor that he had almost forgotten existed. "Blaze," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the casino's ambient noise. "Maybe we should." "Should what?" Blaze snapped, his performance energy spiking with manic intensity. "This is the content of the century, cousin. We're about to go mega viral." The security escort moved through the casino with the solemn dignity of a funeral procession. Other patrons stepped aside and watched with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a public execution. Some recognized Seagal and whispered among themselves, their voices carrying notes of shock and disbelief. "Is that really Steven Seagal?" asked an elderly woman at the slot machines. "What did he do?" her companion replied. "Nothing," came a voice from behind them. "That's the problem." Carmen felt each step like a nail being driven into her conscience. The military had taught her to follow orders, but it had also taught her to recognize honor when she saw it. The man walking beside her possessed more dignity in defeat than she had seen in a lifetime of victories. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. Seagal turned to her with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both understanding and devastating. You're not the one who should be apologizing. The words landed like a physical blow. Carmen had dealt with countless casino disputes, but she had never felt the weight of injustice quite like this. She was facilitating the humiliation of someone who had done nothing wrong, and they both knew it. Behind them, Blaze's entourage followed like a pack of hyenas, their cameras capturing every moment of what they believed was triumph. The live stream had broken all of Blaze's previous records, with viewers from around the world tuning in to witness the spectacle. But something was changing in the chat. The cruel laughter was giving way to uncomfortable questions. Comments began appearing that questioned the fairness of the confrontation, with some viewers calling out the obvious setup. "This doesn't feel right," typed one viewer. "Why are they kicking him out? He didn't do anything," wrote another. "This is just bullying with better cameras," came a third. Nina noticed the shift in sentiment and began to understand that she was documenting something that would be remembered very differently than Blaze intended. The story wasn't about a has-been actor being put in his place. It was about the systematic humiliation of someone who had chosen dignity over retaliation. The casino's main entrance loomed ahead like the gates of exile. The revolving doors that had welcomed Seagal earlier now served as the mechanism of his banishment, their slow rotation marking the rhythm of injustice. "This is as far as I go," Carmen announced, her voice heavy with unspoken apology. Seagal paused at the threshold, his dark eyes taking in the scene behind him, the watching crowd, the cameras, the face of a young man drunk on his own power. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had learned that the most profound truths were often whispered rather than shouted. "The strongest man in the room is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it," he said, his words carrying across the suddenly silent casino floor. "And the loudest voice is usually the one with the least to say." The observation landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of uncomfortable recognition through the crowd. Several people began to applaud, slow and deliberate, until the sound grew into something that resembled respect more than entertainment. Blaze's triumphant grin faltered for just a moment as he realized that his victory was being reframed as something else entirely. But the moment passed, and his confidence returned with the next wave of notifications from his phone. "Keep walking. Legend," he called out, his voice carrying the hollow ring of someone who had won the battle but lost something far more important in the process. Seagal stepped through the revolving doors and into the Atlantic City night, his figure disappearing into the shadows beyond the casino's golden glow. Behind him, the Regal Aces buzzed with the uncomfortable energy of people who had witnessed something they couldn't quite name, a public execution disguised as entertainment, a humiliation that somehow managed to honor its victim while damning its perpetrator. Carmen del Toro stood in the doorway, watching the empty space where Seagal had been, her conscience eating away at her like acid. She had followed orders, maintained protocol, and upheld the casino's interests. But she had also participated in something that felt like a betrayal of everything she had sworn to protect. "Ma'am," one of her officers asked, "are we done here?" Carmen looked back at the casino floor, where Blaze was still performing for his cameras, drunk on his own perceived power. Then she looked out at the empty boardwalk, where a better man had chosen to walk away rather than escalate. "Yeah," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of decision. "We're done here." But even as she spoke the words, she knew that the night was far from over. Some storms built slowly, gathering power in the darkness before returning with devastating force. And Steven Seagal, walking alone into the Atlantic City night, looked very much like the calm before something much more dangerous. The quiet storm was about to learn the difference between leaving and retreating, and Atlantic City was about to discover that some men were more dangerous when they chose not to fight than when they chose to. The night was far from over. The VIP lounge of the Regal Aces had been transformed into Blaze Monroe's personal theater of triumph. Crystal champagne flutes caught the neon light as his entourage celebrated what they believed was their greatest victory yet. The livestream numbers were climbing, 400,000 viewers and rising. But something in the digital atmosphere felt different, charged with an energy that Blaze couldn't quite read. "Did you see his face?" Blaze laughed into his phone, standing on a leather ottoman like a general addressing his troops. 20 years of pretending to be a tough guy, and one little reality check sends him running with his tail between his legs. His designer suit had come undone at the collar, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled from his victory dance. But even as he spoke, the comments on his stream were shifting like sand beneath his feet. What had started as his usual chorus of laughing emojis and fire symbols was slowly filling with something else: criticism, disgust, questions about why he had targeted an older man who had done nothing wrong. Dude, this ain't it. That was actually really sad to watch. Why would you do that to someone's grandfather? Unsubscribing. This is just cruel. Blaze's eyes scanned the comments with growing unease, but he pushed forward with the same aggressive confidence that had built his empire of followers. Haters gonna hate, he announced, dismissing the criticism with a wave of his champagne glass. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, and tonight we cracked the biggest egg in the room. 20 feet away, Ty's slugger Monroe stood with his back against the wall, his massive frame rigid with tension. The ex-boxer had taken enough beatings to recognize the hollow sound of a victory that cost more than it was worth. Every instinct he had developed in the ring was telling him that his cousin had just picked a fight with the wrong opponent. You okay, Ty? Carmen del Toro appeared at his elbow, her security badge catching the light like a weight around her neck. She had been watching the celebration with the same sick fascination that people reserve for car accidents. No, Ty said simply, his voice carrying the quiet honesty of someone who had learned that lies were heavier than truths. That wasn't right, Carmen. None of this was right. Carmen nodded, her jaw tight with the weight of her own compromise. She had spent the last hour replaying the security footage, watching the encounter from every angle. No matter how she looked at it, the story was the same. A young man drunk on his own power had humiliated an older man for no reason other than entertainment. I've been doing this job for 15 years, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over Blaze's continued celebration. Tonight's the first time I felt like I was on the wrong side. Across the lounge, Nina Chun had stopped filming entirely. Her camera sat idle in her lap as she watched Blaze's performance with the growing realization that she was witnessing something that would define her own character as much as his. Her YouTube channel had been built on authentic moments, real stories that revealed something true about human nature. But this wasn't authentic. It was manufactured cruelty disguised as entertainment. Turn the camera back on, Nina, Blaze called out, noticing her hesitation. This is prime content. We're making history here. But Nina shook her head, her finger hovering over the power button. I think I've got enough footage for tonight, she said, her voice carrying a finality that made Blaze's smile falter for just a moment. The party continued, but the energy was draining from it like air from a punctured balloon. Even Blaze's most loyal followers seemed subdued, their laughter forced, their enthusiasm manufactured. The comments on his stream continued to turn, and for the first time in his career, Blaze found himself on the wrong side of his own audience. Outside in the Atlantic City night, Steven Seagal sat in his rental car in the casino's parking garage, the engine running but the car motionless. The neon lights of the city painted abstract patterns across his windshield as he considered his options. Walking away would be the easy choice, the smart choice. He had faced worse humiliations than this, had survived Hollywood politics and international incidents that made tonight's encounter look like a minor inconvenience. But something deeper was stirring, a recognition that this wasn't really about him at all. The young man's cruelty, the crowd's uncomfortable silence, the security guard's whispered apology, they all pointed to something larger, a cultural sickness that had mistaken spectacle for strength, performance for power. Seagal pulled out his phone and scrolled through the social media responses to the night's events. Mixed in with the usual chaos of internet commentary, he found something that surprised him: genuine outrage at the treatment he had received, real concern from people who recognized injustice when they saw it. The audience that Blaze had tried to impress was turning against him, not because they loved Steven Seagal, but because they recognized basic human decency when they saw it violated. He thought about his aikido training, the hours spent learning. That true strength came not from overpowering your opponent, but from redirecting their energy back at them. The young man in the casino had just expended enormous energy trying to humiliate him. What would happen if that energy was redirected? Back in the VIP lounge, The celebration was winding down like a party after the guest of honor had left. Blaze's stream numbers were still climbing, but the comments section had become a battleground between his diehard supporters and a growing chorus of critics. For the first time in his career, Blaze Monroe was experiencing something he had never felt before, the possibility that he might be wrong. "Maybe we should call it a night," Ty suggested, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned to recognize when a fight was truly over. But Blaze shook his head, his eyes wild with the desperate energy of someone who could feel his narrative slipping away. "No way. This is just getting started. Tomorrow, everyone will remember tonight as the night Blaze Monroe showed the world what real power looks like." Neither he nor anyone else in the room realized that outside in the darkness, real power was deciding that some lessons could only be taught in person. The service elevator of the Regal Aces Casino descended into the parking garage with the mechanical whisper of secrets being shared. Carmen del Toro stood beside the control panel, her security master key still warm in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. 15 years of following protocol, of choosing security over justice, had led to this moment. A conscious decision to open the door for the man she had helped humiliate just hours before. Steven Seagal stepped into the elevator with the same fluid grace he brought to everything else, his dark eyes reflecting a quiet determination that made Carmen's breath catch in her throat. He wasn't angry. Anger was too small, too temporary, for what she saw in his face. This was something deeper, more permanent, like watching a mountain decide to move. "You didn't have to do this," Seagal said as the elevator began its ascent, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned that the most powerful words were often the softest ones. "Yes, I did," Carmen replied, her fingers tight around her radio, knowing that every second she spent helping him was another step away from the job that had slowly been killing her soul. "I've spent 8 years in the Navy and 15 years in private security telling myself that following orders was the same thing as doing right. Tonight, I learned the difference." The elevator climbed through the casino's hidden arteries, past the accounting floors where money was counted, past the surveillance rooms where every sin was recorded, past the executive suites where men like Victor Monroe made decisions that rippled through countless lives. With each floor, Carmen felt the weight of her badge growing lighter. "I studied aikido for 6 months in Okinawa," she said, breaking the silence that had settled between them like a prayer. "My instructor taught me that the strongest person in the room is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it." Seagal smiled slightly, the expression transforming his weathered features into something almost gentle. "Your instructor was wise. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply is. Like water finding its way through rock, it shapes the world without needing recognition." The elevator stopped at the service level, just one floor below the VIP lounge, where Blaze's celebration continued. Through the thin walls, they could hear the muffled sound of laughter and music, the hollow celebration of a victory that had already begun to sour. "He's going to destroy himself," Carmen observed, checking her security monitor to ensure the corridor was clear. "The comments on his stream are turning ugly. His own audience is starting to see what kind of person he really is." Sometimes, the most merciful thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences of their choices, Seagal replied, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned that wisdom often came disguised as suffering. "But sometimes, when someone is drowning in their own poison, you have to throw them a rope, even if they use it to hang themselves." They moved through the service corridors with the practiced stealth of two people who understood that true power often worked best in shadows. Carmen's key card opened doors that most casino patrons never knew existed, revealing the hidden infrastructure that kept the illusion of glamour alive. As they approached the service entrance to the VIP lounge, Carmen paused, her hand on the door handle. "What happens after tonight?" Seagal considered the question with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. "Tonight, a young man learns that actions have consequences. Tomorrow, we all decide what kind of people we want to be when those consequences arrive." Through the door, they could hear Blaze's voice, still riding high on what he believed was his greatest triumph. But Carmen could also hear something else, the first cracks in his confidence, the slight tremor that suggested even he was beginning to question whether his victory was worth its price. I should warn you, Carmen said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's got Ty with him. My cousin's a good man, but he's loyal to family. Loyalty is a virtue, Seagal replied, his hand resting lightly on the door handle. But loyalty without wisdom is just another form of blindness. Sometimes the most loyal thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destruction. Carmen stepped back, her part in this quiet drama complete. She had opened the door, literally and figuratively, for justice to return to a room where it had been systematically excluded. What happened next would be up to the men inside, but she had finally chosen the side that would let her sleep at night. Thank you, Seagal said, the words carrying more weight than any medal Carmen had ever earned. Thank you, she replied, understanding that she was thanking him not just for his gratitude, but for giving her the chance to remember what honor felt like. The door opened onto the VIP lounge like a portal between worlds, from the honest shadows of the service corridor into the glittering lie of Blaze Monroe's celebration. Seagal stepped through with the patience of water finding its way downhill, knowing that some forces of nature were unstoppable not because of their violence, but because of their inevitability. The real lesson was about to begin. The VIP lounge fell silent like a symphony hall when the conductor's baton dropped. Conversations died mid-sentence, champagne glasses froze halfway to lips, and every phone camera in the room swiveled toward the service door where Steven Seagal stood like a shadow given substance. He moved into the room with the fluid grace of someone who had learned that true power walked softly and carried no stick at all. Blaze Monroe's face cycled through a kaleidoscope of emotions: surprise, confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear flickering behind his carefully maintained facade. His livestream numbers spiked as his audience sensed that the real show was just beginning. But for the first time in his career, Blaze wasn't sure he was directing the narrative. What the hell? Blaze stammered, his phone camera wavering as his confident grip faltered. Security. How did this fossil get back in here? But Carmen del Toro was nowhere to be seen, and the other security personnel seemed to have mysteriously developed urgent business elsewhere in the casino. Blaze found himself alone with his entourage, facing a man he had humiliated just hours before, and the weight of that humiliation was suddenly pressing down on him like a physical force. Cousin, Ty Slugger, Monroe said quietly, his massive frame shifting into the protective stance that had made him a formidable presence in the boxing ring. Maybe we should. No. Blaze snapped, his voice cracking slightly as he struggled to maintain control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers like water. I handled this joker once. I can handle him again. This is my house. Seagal continued his unhurried approach, his dark eyes never leaving Blaze's face. Every step was measured, deliberate, like a master craftsman approaching his workbench. The crowd parted before him not out of fear, but out of something deeper, the recognition that they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary confrontation. You came back, Blaze said, trying to inject his voice with the same mocking confidence that had served him so well earlier. Couldn't handle being shown up by your betters? Needed one more dose of reality? I came back, Seagal replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned that the most devastating truths were often spoken in whispers, because sometimes walking away from a bully only teaches them that bullying works. Ty stepped forward, loyalty warring with instinct in his scarred features. He had promised his aunt he would protect Blaze, had sworn to be the muscle that kept his cousin safe from the consequences of his own cruelty. But something about the older man's presence made him hesitate, made his boxer's instincts scream warnings that his family obligations tried to silence. I don't want any trouble, Mr. Seagal, Ty said, his hands rising into a defensive position that was more plea than threat. But I can't let you hurt my cousin. Seagal looked at the younger man with something that might have been compassion. In Ty's scarred features, he saw the echo of every soldier who had been asked to follow orders that violated their conscience, every good man who had been forced to choose between loyalty and justice. I understand loyalty, Seagal said, never breaking eye contact with Ty even as he continued his slow approach toward Blaze. But ask yourself, is protecting someone from the consequences of their actions really protecting them at all? The question hung in the air like a blade, and Ty felt it cut through the careful justifications he had built around his cousin's behavior. How many times had he watched Blaze humiliate innocent people? How many times had he told himself that? It was just harmless fun, just the price of fame in the digital age? Move, Blaze ordered, his voice rising to a near shriek as panic began to override his carefully maintained image. I pay you to protect me, not to have philosophical conversations with washed-up movie stars. But Tai found himself frozen, caught between the weight of family obligation and the growing recognition that some protections were really just enablements. In the boxing ring, he had learned to read his opponents, to sense when their confidence was real and when it was manufactured. What he saw in Steven Seagal wasn't anger or vengeance. It was something far more dangerous. It was certainty. Seagal reached the center of the room, close enough now that Blaze could see the depths in his dark eyes, the weight of experience that came from decades of understanding that true strength had nothing to do with dominance. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had learned that the most powerful weapon was often truth itself. You want to know what real power looks like? Seagal asked, his question directed at Blaze, but somehow encompassing everyone in the room. Real power doesn't need an audience. It doesn't require validation from strangers on the internet. It doesn't prove itself by humiliating people who can't fight back. Blaze raised his phone like a shield, his livestream, capturing every moment of what he desperately hoped would become another viral triumph. But the comments section was a waterfall of criticism now, his own audience turning against him as they witnessed something they had never seen before, their idol being quietly dismantled by someone who understood that the deepest cuts were made with words, not fists. Real power, Seagal continued, taking another step forward, is knowing when not to use it. It's choosing mercy when vengeance would be easier. It's understanding that the strongest person in the room is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it. With movements that seemed to flow like water, Seagal simply redirected Tai's defensive stance, using the younger man's own momentum to guide him gently to one knee. There was no violence, no aggression, just the application of principle and physics that left Tai kneeling not in submission, but in something that looked remarkably like respect. The room gasped collectively, Nina Chen's camera capturing the moment when theory became reality, when the quiet strength that Seagal had carried all evening finally revealed itself. But what stunned everyone more than the effortless technique was the gentleness of it, the way Seagal helped Tai back to his feet with the same fluid grace, the absence of any triumph or dominance in his expression. "I'm sorry," Tai whispered, the words carrying the weight of every compromise he had made, every time he had chosen loyalty over conscience. "I'm so sorry." Seagal nodded, understanding flowing between them like current between 2 points of connection. Then he turned to face Blaze Monroe, and the real lesson began. Blaze Monroe stood frozen in the center of his own empire, his phone camera trembling in hands that had never learned the weight of real consequence. The VIP lounge that had been his throne room just moments before now felt like a courtroom, and he was beginning to realize that he might not be the judge. "This is insane," Blaze shouted into his camera, his voice climbing toward hysteria as he struggled to maintain control of a narrative that was rewriting itself in real time. "You're all witnessing assault. This psycho just attacked my cousin." But the livestream comments told a different story. His 3 million followers had watched Tai approach with aggressive intent and seen him gently redirected to his knees without a single strike being thrown. They had witnessed something that transcended their usual diet of manufactured drama. Authentic skill applied with authentic restraint. That wasn't assault. That was art. Your cousin tried to start something and got schooled. How is it possible to look so badass while being so gentle? This is what actual martial arts looks like. Seagal stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his breathing calm, his posture relaxed. He looked like a man who had found his center in the eye of a storm, untouchable not because of his physical skills, but because of something deeper, the unshakable confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was. "You want to talk about what's insane?" Seagal asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned that the most devastating truths were often spoken in whispers. "What's insane is a grown man who thinks his worth is measured by how many strangers watch him humiliate people who can't fight back." Blaze's face flushed red as the words hit home with surgical precision. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've built, what I've accomplished. I know you've built an empire on other people's pain, Seagal replied, taking a step closer. I know you've convinced 3 million people to watch you tear down anyone who makes you feel small. And I know that deep down, you understand that none of it means anything. The truth hung in the air like a blade, and Blaze felt it cut through every defense he had built around his carefully constructed identity. His followers, his wealth, his influence, suddenly it all felt as substantial as smoke. That's not true, Blaze screamed, his voice breaking with the desperation of someone watching their entire worldview collapse. I matter. I have influence. I change things. You change nothing, Seagal said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge, delivering a verdict. You're a parasite feeding on drama you create, a carnival barker selling tickets to watch other people's dignity die. And the saddest part is that you think that makes you powerful. Nina Chen's camera captured every moment, but she found herself crying behind the lens as she watched something she had never seen before. Someone being forced to confront the truth about themselves in front of millions of witnesses. It was brutal and beautiful and somehow necessary, like watching surgery performed on a soul. Ty Slugger, Monroe stepped away from the wall where he had been leaning, his scarred features reflecting a decision that had been building for months. He's right, Blaze, Ty said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truth to family. What we did tonight was wrong. What you do every night is wrong. Shut up, Blaze whirled on his cousin, his phone camera swinging wildly as he lost all pretense of control. You work for me. You protect me. That's what family does. Family protects each other from making mistakes that destroy their souls. Ty replied, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. I should have stopped you a long time ago. I should have been protecting you from yourself. Carmen Del Toro appeared at the edge of the room, her security badge absent from her uniform, her face reflecting the peace that came from finally choosing the right side. She didn't speak, but her presence added weight to the moment. Another person who had decided that witnessing truth was more important than maintaining comfortable lies. Seagal looked around the room, taking in the faces of everyone who had been touched by the evening's events. Nina with her camera, tears streaming down her face as she documented something real. Ty with his newfound courage to speak truth to power. Carmen with her rediscovered sense of honor. Even the other patrons who had gathered at the edges of the room, drawn by the magnetic pull of authentic drama. The thing about bullies, Seagal said, his voice now addressing not just Blaze, but everyone in the room, everyone watching the live stream. Everyone who had ever had to choose between easy cruelty and difficult compassion, is that they're usually the most frightened people in the room. They attack others because they can't face the emptiness inside themselves. Blaze's phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor as his live stream continued to record from a new angle, low and unflattering, like his empire suddenly seemed. The comments were a waterfall now. 3 million people watching someone learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of public judgment. I'm not afraid of anything, Blaze whispered, but the words carried no conviction, no power. They sounded like the last desperate lies a drowning man tells himself. I know, Seagal said, and for the first time that evening, his voice carried something that might have been compassion. That's what makes you so dangerous, to yourself and everyone around you. Fear teaches us limits. Without it, we become monsters. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft sound of Blaze Monroe finally understanding what he had become. In the glittering heart of Atlantic City, surrounded by the neon promises of easy wealth and easier fame, a young man was learning that some prices were too high to pay, even for an empire built on other people's humiliation. The lesson was almost complete, but the most important part, what came after the truth was revealed, still remained to be written. The silence in the VIP lounge stretched like a held breath, broken only by the soft electronic hum of phones, recording what would become the most shared video in social media history. Steven Seagal stood in the center of the room like the eye of a storm that had finally passed, his presence somehow larger and smaller than it had been moments before, larger because of the dignity he had maintained throughout the ordeal, smaller because he wore his power so lightly that it seemed almost invisible. Blaze Monroe sat crumpled in a leather chair, his empire of followers watching him learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of public judgment. His phone lay forgotten on the marble floor, its screen cracked, but still recording, still broadcasting his complete moral collapse to 3 million people who were witnessing something they had never seen before. Their idol revealed as fully, devastatingly human. "I think," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned that the most important lessons were often taught through mercy rather than punishment. "We're finished here." He turned toward the exit with the same unhurried grace he had brought to everything else that evening. But before he could take a step, Ray Stacks, D'Angelo appeared at the entrance to the VIP lounge. The veteran dealer had abandoned his post at the baccarat table, something unprecedented in his 35 years of working Atlantic City casinos. "Mr. Seagal," Ray said, his weathered hands extended in the universal gesture of respect that transcended all boundaries of age, race, and social standing. "It's been an honor." The handshake that followed was more than a farewell. It was a recognition, one craftsman acknowledging another's mastery. In Ray's eyes, Seagal could see the reflection of every honest game he had ever dealt, every moment when skill and character had triumphed over luck and bluster. "The honor was mine," Seagal replied, meaning every word. "You deal with more integrity than most people live with." As they shook hands, a slow ripple of applause began somewhere in the back of the room. It started with Nina Chun, who had finally set down her camera and was clapping with tears still streaming down her face. Carmen Del Toro joined in, her applause carrying the weight of someone who had rediscovered what it meant to serve with honor. Ty Slugger Monroe added his massive hands to the sound, each clap an apology for every time he had chosen loyalty over conscience. The applause spread through the room like wildfire, encompassing not just the VIP lounge, but spilling out into the main casino floor where word of the confrontation had spread in whispers and hurried text messages. Dealers abandoned their tables. Cocktail waitresses set down their trays. Even the usually impassive security guards found themselves joining in the recognition of something they might never see again: authentic grace under fire. But Seagal seemed almost embarrassed by the attention, raising his hand gently to quiet the applause. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed casino floor. "This is about remembering that how we treat people when we think no one is watching is who we really are." He walked through the casino with the same measured pace he had maintained all evening, but now the recognition that followed him was different. It wasn't the celebrity worship that had greeted his arrival, but something deeper, the acknowledgement that they had witnessed someone live up to the ideals that most people only talked about. Carmen Del Toro held the main exit door for him, her face reflecting the peace that came from finally choosing principle over paycheck. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing the question that seemed to hang in the air around everyone who had been touched by the evening's events. "Now," Seagal replied, pausing to look back at the casino floor one last time, "everyone decides what kind of person they want to be tomorrow." Behind them, in the VIP lounge, Blaze Monroe was learning what that decision felt like. His live stream numbers were still climbing, but the comments had become a flood of criticism, disappointment, and something that might have been pity. For the first time in his career, he was trending for all the wrong reasons. Ty knelt beside his cousin's chair, his scarred features reflecting a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "We can fix this," he said quietly, asterisk. "But it starts with you admitting what you did was wrong." Blaze looked up at his cousin through eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of a single evening. "What if I can't?" he whispered, the question carrying the weight of someone who had built his entire identity on being right, on being powerful, on being untouchable. "Then you learn how," Ty replied, his voice carrying the gentle firmness of someone who had finally found the courage to love through truth rather than enablement. "And I'll help you, but only if you really want to change." Outside, Steven Seagal stepped into the Atlantic City night, the neon lights of the casino casting colored shadows across his face. He had walked into the Regal Aces seeking nothing more than a quiet evening at the baccarat tables. He was leaving having reminded everyone who witnessed his presence, in person and through the miracle of live streaming, that true strength was not about domination but about discipline, not about winning but about how you handled both victory and defeat. His rental car waited in the parking garage, but before he got in, Seagal paused to look back at the glittering facade of the casino. Somewhere inside, a young man was beginning the hardest journey any human being could undertake. The journey from who he had been to who he might become. Whether Blaze Monroe would complete that journey remained to be seen, but the first step had been taken. The lesson was complete, but its echoes would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, touching lives in ways that none of them could yet imagine. The morning sun painted Atlantic City in shades of gold and promise, its light transforming the neon-soaked landscape of the previous night into something clean and new. The Regal Aces Casino stood like a monument to possibility, its windows reflecting a world where anything could happen, including redemption. Nina Chen sat in her hotel room, surrounded by memory cards and laptop screens displaying the footage that would change her life forever. She had been editing for 6 hours straight, crafting not just a viral video but a meditation on character, dignity, and the cost of choosing spectacle over substance. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed the final words of her description. Last night, I witnessed something I've never seen before. Someone teach a masterclass in honor without saying a word about honor. Someone demonstrate strength by refusing to use it. Someone show us what real power looks like when it chooses mercy over vengeance. This isn't about celebrity or social media or viral moments. This is about who we are when we think no one is watching, and who we become when everyone is. The video had been live for less than an hour, but it was already approaching 1 million views. The comments section, usually a wasteland of cruelty and mindless noise, had become something unprecedented. A space where people shared stories of their own encounters with bullies, their own moments of choosing right over easy, their own struggles to find dignity in a world that seemed to reward its opposite. Across town, Carmen Del Toro sat in a coffee shop with her resignation letter on the table before her, her phone buzzing with job offers from security firms who had heard about her choice to stand with principle over protocol. But the offer that interested her most had come from an unexpected source, a veterans organization that needed someone to head security for their counseling centers, places where broken soldiers learned to rebuild their lives one day at a time. She thought about Steven Seagal's words from the night before. Real power is knowing when not to use it. After 15 years of using her authority to enforce other people's rules, the idea of using it to protect people who were healing from their own battles felt like coming home. At the Regal Aces, Ray Stacks, D'Angelo dealt his morning shift with the same professional precision he had brought to the job for 35 years, but something had changed in the way he carried himself. Every so often, a player would ask about the previous night's events, and Ray would smile slightly before responding. I saw a ghost remind the living how to live. The story had spread through the casino like wildfire, growing with each telling, until it had taken on the quality of legend. Some of the details had been embellished. Seagal's words had become more profound, his movements more graceful, the confrontation more dramatic. But the core truth remained unchanged. They had witnessed someone live up to ideals that most people only pretended to hold. In the penthouse office that overlooked the casino floor, Victor Monroe watched the social media metrics with the calculating gaze of someone who had built an empire by reading the winds of public opinion. The video of his son's humiliation was approaching 10 million views, and the comment sections were universally condemnatory. The Regal Aces reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was hemorrhaging with each share, each angry emoji, each story of someone who had decided they would never give their money to a casino that enabled such cruelty. We need to distance ourselves, his PR manager had advised. Complete separation. Maybe even a public statement condemning his actions. But Victor Monroe had spent 60 years learning to read people, and what he saw in the footage wasn't just a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. He saw his own legacy reflected in his son's actions. The systematic teaching that power meant dominance, that wealth justified cruelty, that other people existed only to serve his family's interests. The young man on the screen was a mirror, showing him exactly what his parenting had created. In a modest apartment across town, Blaze Monroe sat staring at his phone screen, watching his follower count drop by thousands with each passing hour. The algorithm that had once amplified his cruelty was now amplifying his downfall. serving his humiliation to millions of people who were discovering that they preferred dignity to drama, character to chaos. But scattered among the criticism were other messages, people who had recognized something familiar in his breakdown, people who had seen their own capacity for cruelty reflected in his actions and decided they wanted to be better. A teacher who had bullied struggling students apologized to her class. A manager who had humiliated his employees in front of their peers called them into his office to make amends. A teenage influencer deleted years of content built on other people's pain and posted a simple message: "I want to be better." Thai slugger Monroe knocked softly on his cousin's door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the weight of a conversation that had been years in the making. "You ready to talk about what happens next?" Blaze looked up from his phone, his face reflecting the hollow exhaustion of someone who had spent the night confronting the truth about themselves. "I don't know how to be different," he said, the admission carrying more courage than any stunt he had ever performed. "Neither do I," Ty replied, settling into the chair across from his cousin. "But I figure we can learn together. And maybe we start by apologizing to everyone we hurt on the way to becoming who we were." Miles away, Steven Seagal's rental car crossed the bridge leading out of Atlantic City, the morning sun painting the skyline in his rearview mirror. He had come seeking a quiet evening at the Cards and was leaving having reminded a room full of strangers and millions more watching online. That strength without compassion was just violence with better marketing. His phone buzzed with interview requests, movie offers, endorsement deals from companies that wanted to associate themselves with his viral moment of grace. But Seagal silenced the phone and rolled down his windows, letting the Atlantic breeze carry away the noise of a world that had confused celebrity with character for far too long. Behind him, Atlantic City gleamed in the morning light, its casinos and hotels standing like monuments to the eternal human desire for transformation. The hope that tonight might be different, that the next hand might change everything, that redemption was always just one choice away. In the end, that's exactly what had happened. Not through luck or chance, but through the simple decision to treat others with the dignity that every human being deserved. The lesson would ripple outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water, touching lives in ways that none of them could imagine, proving that the most powerful force in the world wasn't dominance or wealth or followers. It was character, quiet and unshakable, walking through the world with the patience of water wearing away stone, changing everything it touched without needing recognition or reward. The story was over, but its echoes would last forever. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.